Byline Audio.
¿Hablas español?
Sprichst du Deutsch?
Kann du Norsk?
If you've heard that sound from Babbel before, I bet you do. Babbel is the science-backed language learning app that actually works. With quick 10-minute lessons handcrafted by over 200 language experts, Babbel gets you on your way to speaking a new language in just a few weeks. With over 16 million subscriptions sold and a 20-day money-back guarantee, just start speaking another language with Babbel. Right now, up to 55% off your Babbel subscription at babbel.com/Spotify podcast. Spelled BABBEL.com/Spotify podcast. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Hey, what's up, guys? I'm Fred Warner, linebacker for the San Francisco 49ers. Abercrombie has the new suits you need, plus all the collared shirts to go with them. The Abercrombie & Fitch Collins suit is the only suit you'll ever need for any occasion. Available in slim, classic, and athletic. Pair with a collared classic. Go with a soft, easy-to-wear sweater polo or a comfortable long-sleeve shirt. With so many different fits and fabrics, you can make a look that's completely your own. Add the Abercrombie & Fitch Collins suit and new collared shirts to every occasion this season. Shop online or in store.
Hi there and welcome to the Byline podcast from the Byline Times. My name is Adrian Goldberg. This time Liverpool as a city and as a symbol of obsolescence. It was once the port of empire but has now outlived its original purpose and, like many post-industrial towns in the UK, is struggling for a new identity. Let's be clear from the start. This episode is not a knocking exercise. I love Liverpool and its people, and on a previous podcast, we discussed the othering of the city by the London-based media. So that's not what we're about, nor is it Sam Wetherell's intention to demonise the place in his new book, Liverpool and the Unmaking of Britain, which is a kind of love letter exploring how Merseyside was abandoned by the capital, and by capital, when it was deemed surplus to requirements, and never mind the people left behind. Sam, welcome to the Byline podcast. The first thing I want to observe, and you touch on this in the book, is that in many ways Liverpool is an atypical UK city. It's got a very distinctive culture and a sense of apartness, both geographically and politically, from the rest of the UK. So how can you make Liverpool speak for the rest of the United Kingdom?
That's a great question. And almost all work written on Liverpool by historians over the last generation has made this point, that Liverpool is fundamentally different to the rest of Britain. Liverpool's economy was dominated by trade, while Northern England's economy was obviously dominated mostly by industry. Liverpool's politics was dominated by Irish nationalism, by Protestant conservatism, and the city was very, very late to developing a Labour council and developing any kind of liberal politics either. And of course, the city's society is very much shaped by empire, and its Black and Chinese communities have very different historical formations to the Black and Chinese communities of other cities in Britain. So what I'm arguing, though, is that our current political moment, the situation that we find ourselves in Britain at the moment, demands that we return to Liverpool's history and argue instead that Liverpool is the place we need to look to understand Britain's present and Britain's future. Britain's combined overlapping crises of economic obsolescence, of climate change, of homelessness, of far-right political violence, as well as some of the more hopeful things, such as the new demands for black civil rights from London to St. Louis, all of which are prefigured and found in Liverpool's recent history. So there's a wonderful line from the US historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who says that new voices ring out from the historical darkness and demand to be heard in the present. And I think that that's true for us. We need to return to Liverpool's history.
Well, we talk about post-industrial decline, and I'm sitting to you here talking in Birmingham, and the West Midlands has been subject to post-industrial decline, obviously many parts of northern England. That is in many ways a code for post-imperial decline. And I suppose that's where Liverpool becomes the perfect case study, because it was a city built on empire. And as empire declines, there may be a number of factors for this, but as empire declines, Liverpool falls away more rapidly and more dramatically than any other English city of comparable size.
Yes, absolutely. And so often these stories of the two great narratives of post-war British history, deindustrialization and decolonization, are told as two separate stories that affect two different kinds of communities. Whereas the thing that's so interesting and so important about Liverpool is that Liverpool's working class was a racially segmented working class that could be found all across the world. So you had tens of thousands of dock workers, many of whom were Irish migrants, but all of whom were white, many of whom had arrived from Ireland, but most of whom were working only a few miles from where they were born, laboring in the heart of the city in the middle of the 20th century. But the other side of the story was the tens of thousands of black and Chinese, some were white, but mainly black, Chinese, Somalian, Yemeni seamen, a community that spanned the world, that transformed cities like Freetown in Sierra Leone, transformed parts of Shanghai, transformed parts of Hong Kong. And as Liverpool's port economy began to slowly unravel as early as the interwar period, this white community that lived in Liverpool were rescued. They were rescued through the arrival of job security in the docks during World War II. They were rescued through light industrial policies that moved tens of thousands of people out of slums into new housing estates and gave them new jobs in light industrial plants that were channeled by state capacity industrial policy, while a lot of the remaining people of color in the city were deported in the case of thousands of Chinese seamen after the Second World War, had their lives denigrated or concentrated into small, overly policed, unequal, desperately poor neighborhoods in the case of many of the city's black community. So part of my argument is that allowing us to see deindustrialization and decolonization together helps us understand a much more complex social formation within the city of Liverpool that is often overlooked by these quite romantic, often white, tragic stories of deindustrialization. And that's not to say that it's not a tragedy for everybody involved in this process, but it is to tell a much more expansive, more global, and more complex story.
In Liverpool's case, that racial segregation was perhaps more profound than in any other comparable UK city. In the early 80s, the Toxteth riots bore witness to that. And of course, there were riots in other UK cities in the 1980s as well. But there was something about the nature of race relations in Liverpool that was, I think, particular to that city.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the first thing to say is that there were uprising and mass protests in 1980 and 1981 in multiple different British cities, but Toxteth was by far the biggest on really any metric we can calculate from the number of arrests, the amount of property damage, the amount of injuries. It was bigger than the 1980 uprising in St. Paul's in Bristol and the 1981 Brixton uprising combined. This was the biggest instance of civil disorder outside of Northern Ireland in post-war Britain. And it was also the only place in mainland Britain still where CS gas, tear gas was used. It was fired relatively indiscriminately by the police at protesters. So the tragedy of over-policing, of economic abandonment was felt particularly harshly by the black community. You had, by the early 1980s, the estimated unemployment rate in parts of Toxteth, the neighbourhood with the highest rates of black settlement, was as high as 75%. And the Gifford inquiry, which investigated the city's race relations after the uprising, which reported in the late 1980s, in 1989, famously described race relations in the city as quote unquote uniquely horrific, that Liverpool was uniquely bad at providing council jobs, secure housing, forms of welfare, elderly care, really any kind of metric, not just to its black, but also its Chinese community. But what I also want to say is that this community has produced spectacular, creative, really thoughtful instances of rebellion, but also more interesting, subtle formations. It's the place with the first black basketball team in Britain. It has a rich legacy of boxing, a slightly later rich history of football. It has a really proud black feminist politics, which organized primarily around healthcare inequalities incredibly successfully in the 1980s. So it was a community that staked its own claim in a really hostile and unequal city.
It's interesting as you talk about it in this way, Sam, though, but we're kind of then getting towards a microcosm of British society in that we have post-industrial decline, which is also post-imperial decline, decolonisation. Very often those two features are uncoupled, but actually they are very closely related because once Britain starts to lose its empire, some of the commercial advantage that it enjoys and which drives the Industrial Revolution, that advantage is lost. But it's also, until that point, an inverted commas, a success story, which is marbled through with racism and a hierarchy of skin colour with which British society arguably still hasn't quite come to terms with.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting that you draw attention very rightly to the fact that these inequalities were very, very manifest at the quote unquote heyday of Britain's imperial global supremacy. We can think about what's happening in Liverpool as a kind of racism forged in the context of decline, which is quite a different kind of racism to a racism forged in the context of supremacy and wealth. And some of the irony, I think, of Liverpool, and this is something I really end the book by talking about, Liverpool's plans for regeneration is to draw on its own history to attract tourists, to renovate buildings, to create a UNESCO World Heritage Centre, which comes with its own benefits and drawbacks. And the city has made an attempt to come to terms with its enormous role in the slave trade. But beyond that, often the city's kind of global nature is conflated with a kind of cosmopolitanism. You know, this was a sort of rough and ready global city of trade that was cosmopolitan, and a lot of that violence gets kind of set aside. And I actually argue for quite crude reasons, in that this version of the city's history is quite central actually to these plans for urban regeneration, for telling a certain kind of story, which is also true in lots of other places in Britain as well, I think.
In the early 1980s, which is when I first encountered Liverpool, it was a very scary place. Now, over the years, I've come to really love and admire the people of Liverpool, and I've had many great days and nights in Liverpool. It does have a wonderful character. I know that's a kind of cliche of Liverpool, but it is true. It's one of the reasons why, for example, it's been allowed to partly reinvent itself as a destination for stag parties. It's a great place to just hang around and to be around. And it has forged a new identity, or a series of new identities, since the 1980s. I want to talk about those, but talk to me about that period, because it did feel as though Liverpool was abandoned by Westminster. There was kind of a massive separation between it and Parliament, it seemed. The riots were obviously part of that, but people abandoned it as well. I mean, it lost more people, again, than any other city of comparable size in the UK, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Liverpool's depopulation is extraordinary. The city halved in population between 1930 and the millennium, basically decreasing from roughly 1 million to roughly 500,000 people. And actually, the city lost almost a third of its population in just a 20-year window between 1960 and 1980. And some of this was deliberate state-sponsored plans to suburbanize its population, to disassemble its slums, but a lot of it was just flight from urban disaster. And the story of the abandonment from Westminster is made most chilling, I think, by this famous memo written by Geoffrey Howe, who was Margaret Thatcher's chancellor, written just after the 1981 uprising, and it only recently came to light. It was obviously under lock and key for 30 years, but it was rediscovered in the National Archives. It basically called for the abandonment of the city. It used the term managed decline. Geoffrey Howe said that we can't make water flow uphill, that Liverpool should be just left to ruin and decay. And obviously that didn't happen to the way that Geoffrey Howe imagined it would. But we can still see, I would say, a form of managed decline in the city. And certainly the big interventions of Thatcher's government, the Merseyside Development Corporation, spearheaded by Michael Heseltine, the National Garden Festival, the Enterprise Zone, all of these very targeted interventions, and they redesigned what cities should look like. But they did very little, particularly to service and to reduce some of the inequalities within the black community. Liverpool still remains extremely unequal. So I think that although the very chilling vision of managed decline, as outlined by Geoffrey Howe, was never fully materialized, we should still take that seriously as, some of the thinking that was going on at the time.
Since then, and this is where there is at least some element of success, Liverpool has reinvented itself. I'd say the city now is almost unrecognisable in a good way from how it was in the 1980s. So obviously, significant economic decline until the 1980s, maybe into the 90s. But like many UK cities, it has reinvented itself. It's been forced to reinvent itself. So you've got the Albert Dock, which has got 4 destination museums, including, as you've hinted at there, Museum of Slavery. It's got an incredible nighttime economy, at least in the centre of Liverpool. So, how successful would you say it has been in creating a new identity for itself as a different kind of place?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I should preface all of this by saying that I'm a historian rather than a politician or a present day commentator. What I'm trying to tell is a historical story that understands rather than gives a thumbs up or a thumbs down to what is currently happening in the city of Liverpool or how it was redeveloped. And my story really kind of finishes in the early 2000s. But I would say that obviously the unbelievable crisis that the city was passing through in the 1980s is no longer felt in the same way in the city, but those times have changed, but that moment has passed away. But I would also point to some of the limits and contradictions of the way that the city has been revitalized and reimagined. I think one of the best ways into this actually is to imagine. So very, very famously, Michael Heseltine, who was Margaret Thatcher's environment minister, was like sent to Liverpool, or he sent himself to Liverpool to sort of spearhead its regeneration. And he came up with this new way of thinking about British cities and urban planning in this very famous memo, which was called It Took a Riot. And this became a sort of intellectual basis for the ways that cities would be reimagined. So instead of cities in Britain and really actually across the world becoming places that would service the welfare of their own residents by raising taxes and redistributing the money, cities would instead be competing for global pools in a zero-sum race against other cities for tourists, for jobs, for money, for visitors, for things like that. And this is where you see Liverpool trying to bid for an AstraZeneca plant recently, but also things like the 2008 City of Culture, the same dynamic that produces the 2012 London Olympics, things like that. So there's this new way of thinking about cities. This is a global change, but the British iteration of this was spearheaded by Michael Heseltine's memo, It Took a Riot. Now, what's so often forgotten is that if we were to see this as something beneficial, then the plaudits should go to the black community or the multiracial uprising that demanded these changes. If it did take a riot, then we should be grateful for the riot, so to speak. And so often, this is told as like a top-down story, as a city being grateful for beneficial regeneration from the city council, the national government, whereas I want to write the agency of Liverpool's people into this a little bit more, but also point to some of its contradictions as well. So, for example, the black community say that the Albert Dock was regenerated, it was turned into this kind of theme park-style destination. But all that happened in Toxteth was a row of new trees were planted through the middle of a neighborhood. And famously, even those were planted by contract workers who were bussed in from elsewhere. So I want to point to some of the contradictions with the big preface that as a historian, it's not my job, fortunately, to say whether this is good or bad.
But your book is called Liverpool and the Unmaking of Britain. Part of the story you tell is about the remaking of Britain as well. And you do point to the future, to Liverpool having significant waterside developments. There is the Bramley Moor Dock Stadium on the waterfront, to which Everton FC are moving, for example. There has been the Liverpool One shopping centre. But you talk about climate change, and that's the kind of the next issue facing Liverpool and all coastal cities. I mean, of course, it's facing all of us, but it is particularly threatening for a city on the coast, as Liverpool is. And notwithstanding your expertise as a historian, you do point towards that as a challenge for Liverpool in particular.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the redevelopment that you speak of, which includes Everton's new £500 million stadium, which they're moving into next season, it basically encompasses a huge swathe of land up and down the northern section of the city's riverbank. And it's spearheaded by this company called Peel Holdings. And this development has been, like so many big infrastructural projects in Britain, has been constantly pushed back and back and back. And Peel have said at different times that this may take 50 years to complete. And okay, if we're thinking it's going to take 50 years to complete, it doesn't take much time on the IPCC's flood level publicly available website to see that potentially within a generation after its completion, parts of this redevelopment will be uninhabitable. So what is this? This seems like a kind of madness, this kind of massive glitzy regeneration with what will be the tallest tower outside of London, the Shanghai Tower at 55 stories with its kind of plazas, its high-end development, its shops, its shopping malls. There's something kind of fantastical, but also closed off to the realities of the future to this redevelopment. And I say that someone who was born in 1920 in Liverpool would have seen this city go from being the second biggest city in England, the second wealthiest city in England, this huge imperial cosmopolitan metropolis, falling apart, depopulating, becoming obsolete. Whereas someone who was born in 2020 may live long enough to see significant parts of the city even disappear.
That's a pretty chilling note on which to end, isn't it? Well, good luck to Liverpool and all who sail in her. Liverpool and the Unmaking of Britain by Sam Wetherill is out now on the head of Zeus Publishers. Thanks for your time, Sam. And thank you for listening to this episode of the Byline podcast. If you do want to support our work here on the podcast, do check out the Byline Times. It's our brilliant monthly news periodical, which contains the best of our online articles with content that you can't read anywhere else. Do head over to bylinetimes.com, our news-breaking website, and take out a subscription if you can. This episode was produced by me and Harvey White in Birmingham. See you now. Bye-bye.
Byline Audio.